Soon, transgender people will destroy women's sports forever! Yes, with this step, our master plan will soon reach fruition. First, we destroyed your ability to be comfortable in the Denny's public restroom. Next, it will be women's sports. And finally, we will destroy the very scientific concept of DNA as we know it, confusing all scientists who study chromosomes with our very existence, thereby reversing evolution single-handedly and taking humanity back to single-celled organisms. Obviously, when it comes to the topic of trans women in sports, there is a lot of hyperbole and fear-mongering to be had. But for many people, myself included, the idea of transgender people in sports, especially trans women in women's sports, is a really hard topic to discuss. At first glance, it seems to make sense that cisgender women, or women who are born with genetics that make them appear to be women from birth, are at a disadvantage to trans women. Most of us, and again, myself included, learned from biology class that those born with XY chromosomes can build muscle mass faster, and are just generally predisposed to be stronger. So when a trans woman with these genetics competes against a cis woman, clearly the trans woman is more likely to win because, say it with me here folks, biology.
Biology is biology.
But what if I told you it's actually much more complicated than that? That maybe trans women in sports don't actually have an inherent advantage at all. And even if we did, the whole debate in general about how trans women and biology plays into sports highlights a flaw at the very basis of what we think about athletics. Would saying something like that get you to watch this whole video? Because if not, I can do like a dance or something. I'm dancing for you. But seriously, let's take a look at the question. Are trans women really ruining women's sports? Now, to be completely fair, I will admit that I'm a bit biased here. Obviously, as a trans woman, I know many will argue that I have a perceived inclination to want to side with transgender people on this issue. I have some skin in the game, as it were. I mean, I don't really have any in sports in general because I'm just as unathletic now as I was before I transitioned. Hell, I can barely walk up my stairs without needing to stop for a hydration break. And if you asked me to name a sports team outside of the Yankees, it'd take me a second to think of one. I know the Cardinals are a team. I'm not entirely sure what they play, but they do play a sport. But first and foremost, just because I'm trans doesn't mean I can't look at something objectively. Saying otherwise is a BS argument that many use to silence people who speak up against an issue. You're biased. Obviously you can't speak about it. Only I, as someone so far removed from the situation, can speak with authority on this matter. It's BS. As long as you recognize your inclinations and try to see things objectively, then you can talk about a subject. But also, and this may shock you, I actually for the longest time believed that trans women don't belong in women's sports. I didn't really talk about it because I felt like I didn't know enough about the topic, nor did I really have any informed solution to offer. But now I do! Or at least I stopped being too lazy to Google the topic. There is one issue we have to address before diving into the meat of the issue, and that's the problem with how this whole argument is typically framed. Some argue that allowing trans women in sports costs cisgender women careers or opportunities. They say, look, I'm not transphobic, I totally support trans people, but we also need to support women athletes as well.
Many people are actually saying, look, come on, we are not transphobic whatsoever. We understand that transphobic men and women have gone through a really tough process and we very much support them, but actually we also need to support female athletes as well.
So they say allowing transgender women into women's sports will destroy women's sports because transgender women will dominate. Some point to the example of Celine Soulé, a 16-year-old high schooler who is extremely good at the 55-meter dash, but lost to trans women Terry Miller and Andrea Yearwood, two transgender women who beat her in competition. This loss cost Soulé the chance at a scholarship. Now, that seems pretty upsetting. People also point to athletes like Rachel McKinnon, who is the UCI Masters Track Championship women's 350mm sprint gold medalist, or Laurel Hubbard, the Australian Women's Weightlifting 2017 Oceania Weightlifting Championship 90 kilo division. Why do all these sports have to have really long titles? Or Fallon Fox, a transgender MMA fighter. Or Hannah Mouncey, who competed in the AFL Victoria Women's League. People say that all these trans women's successes are evidence that they are dominating women's sports. Now, I believe that many of these people who make these arguments are not trying to be transphobic, but intentional or not, they are being extremely misrepresentative or disingenuous. First and foremost, looking at the case of Su Ye, the high schooler who lost to two trans women, the story is typically framed as a loss for the young cis woman. But you do realize that there are also two women in this story who trained hard, worked hard, and eventually got the gift of a lifetime by winning a scholarship for their incredible feats in the field. It's the two trans women. This whole narrative framing Su Ye as unjustly having her rightful scholarship torn from her makes it seem that cisgender success is viewed as more worthy than transgender success. But I assure you, those two trans women put in just as much effort and practice as Su Ye did. I'm not saying that I don't wish Su Ye all the success in the world. I do, but her success shouldn't be seen as more worthwhile than a trans person's. As for all the examples of trans women dominating women's sports, that's not really the case. Rachel McKinnon doesn't hold a world record in her field, unlike many cisgender women. And not to mention, she's won the gold medal exactly one time. The woman next to her in this picture has beaten Rachel 10 out of 12 times before Rachel won the gold. Fallon Fox certainly has an impressive 5-1 win record, but she was TKO'd by a cisgender woman in the women's featherweight tournament final. So it's not like she's outrageously outmatching her opponents. She can and does lose to cisgender women. Laurel Hubbard, the woman who won the weightlifting championship, when put up against a much larger worldwide competition, she lost. She actually failed to make a lift at her most recent competition. Her largest lift was 328 pounds, compared to the 425 pounds that cis women at the top of Hubbard's league have lifted. During the 1 year that Paula Mounty's team played, they came in 5th at the AFL Women's League. Now, I'm certain these trans women are working incredibly hard to win and compete at the top of their game, and their successes are evidence of that. But to say they are destroying women's sports is incredibly hyperbolic. It'd be like saying I'm destroying the pie industry just because I managed to eat 4 pies last Thanksgiving, which, to be fair, is the only type of competition that I would win. Now, I'm not bringing all these up to be like, haha, screw you, see, trans women don't have an unfair advantage. But the issue here is that so many people point to these trans athletes as examples that trans women will win when placed against cisgender women. But they do that without providing all the context of these women's actual careers. And by doing so, they vilify transgender people without actually providing evidence to support the claim that trans women have an unfair advantage in sports. And scapegoating trans people without actually doing the research is incredibly dangerous, especially considering how vulnerable many in the transgender community are. We face discrimination in sports, yes, but also in housing, employment, school, and numerous other areas. Transgender people, especially transgender women of color, are the most at risk for domestic abuse and murder. So to vilify us further is dangerous. So now that we've discarded the framing of cisgender women over trans women, let's actually take a look at the crux of this argument. Does being a trans woman give someone an advantage over cis women? Well, it's argued that transgender women have higher muscle mass and distribution, mostly due to testosterone and going through male puberty. But does science actually back this up in the long run, especially after trans women go through hormone replacement therapy? One of the most in-depth scientific studies to date done on trans women in sports, Sports and Transgender People, a systemic review of the literature relating to sports participation and competitive sports policies, lovely title, just flows right off the tongue, very Shakespearean, states, quote, currently, there is no direct or consistent research suggesting transgender female individuals or male individuals have an athletic advantage at any stage of their transition, e.g. cross-sex hormones, gender-confirming surgery, and therefore competitive sports policies that place restrictions on transgender people need to be considered and potentially revised. I'll link to the study below, but it says basically this. Yes, men do have statistically higher muscle mass and distribution caused by hormones, but trans women who have gone through hormone replacement therapy do not. Taking estrogen and testosterone blockers, which many trans women do willingly as part of transition, causes a decrease in muscle mass, strength, and speed, putting them on par with cis women. Sometimes they can even have lower testosterone levels than cisgender women. Psst, one of those people would be me. Not much testosterone going on here. Though my bullies probably could have told you that at about age 5. These lower testosterone levels also lower the proportion of oxygen-carrying red blood cells, which lowers our stamina. The increased estrogen boosts fat storage, especially around the hips. Sure, some trans women can be physically bigger than cisgender women, but that's not always a good thing. Being bigger can make you slower, take more energy to do things, and get out of breath easier. And again, Size doesn't mean that your muscle mass is still in ratio with your size. And even more, not all trans women are bigger than cisgender women. So we can see, the science doesn't actually say that trans women have a real advantage over cis women. But hey, I hear some of you out there in the comments section. Believe me, I hear you. You say, well, forget your science. I know what common sense tells me, and common sense tells me that trans women, or biological men as I see it, will always have a general advantage over cis women. Now, personally, I don't agree with that. But even if that were 100% the case, we can still see that it causes an issue. Because the solution that we currently have now, using that argument as a basis, is that we don't allow trans people to compete in certain sports. And if this whole argument is talking about things in the interest of fairness, simply discriminating against an entire group of people based on who they are seems more than a little unfair to me. So what's the solution to that argument? Well, to be honest, I think the whole idea of us splitting sports up by gender is honestly antiquated. And oh god, I know, here I am, the trans woman who wants you to destroy all your concepts of sex and gender and leave us in an anarchy wasteland straight out of Mad Max. I mean, to be fair, if I get to hang out with Charlize Theron and Tom Hardy, yeah, then that's my plan. But seriously, I'm not saying that we should eliminate gender, just that maybe gender should play less of a role than it currently does in sports. I ask in all fairness, why do we split things up between men and women's sports?
Biology is biology.
And I get that it was a very easy and handy way to split people up and give us as fair a playing field as we could have hoped for before we had better tools to determine these things. But we live in a world where we can more easily quantify and discern better ways to play. I would argue that some of the best women's athletes could kick the butt out of some of the best male athletes. Just look at the famous Battle of the Sexes tennis match for an example of that. So why can't we come up with a better system that not only allows people to compete with better matched opponents, regardless of gender, but also allows room for transgender people to compete without issue? To show the ridiculousness of our gender stratification, look at the recent controversy surrounding Caster Semenya. Semenya is a woman whose body produces abnormally high levels of testosterone, but she also happens to be an Olympic gold medalist. But because the International Association of Athletics Federation has a rule that tries to pigeonhole and define what types of women are allowed to compete as women, Semenya has been disallowed from competing in the women's 800 and 1,500 meter dash due to her testosterone levels. If she wanted to compete, she'd have to take testosterone blockers. That seems ridiculous. That's just how she was literally born. She's not even trans at all. Isn't the whole point of sports to celebrate what the human body can do? Yet because we cling to outdated ideas of gender and sex, and not to mention a little racism considering Semenya is a woman of color, an Olympic gold medalist in her prime won't be allowed to compete. This just proves to me we need to find new ways to delineate sports outside of gender. And I know that this is a ways off. It's not going to change tomorrow. I'm not going to sit here and say, I know best the way to determine who gets to play baseball and what qualifications or anything like that. That will take time, experts, and studies to come to understand. And it's going to change from sport to sport. But I think framing the whole debate as simply pro-trans people or anti-trans people really diminishes the complexities of this issue, while also running the risk of vilifying and scapegoating the entire transgender community. Sports are all about reveling in the spirit of a good and fair game, and celebrating human physical achievement, from the individual to working as part of a team. So shouldn't we always strive to celebrate the entire spectrum of what human beings can achieve, no matter who we are? That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more discussions of LGBTQ issues or pop culture news or Star Trek, give my channel a subscribe. And if you want to help make these videos even better, consider giving to my Patreon page. Every little bit helps. It honestly means a lot and helps me pay my bills, which are getting harder right now to pay due to some family stuff and some job stuff. So again, if you can give to my Patreon page, it would honestly mean a lot. And until next time, live long and prosper.